Okay. So I'm just going to repeat the first objective, but just sum it up just because, we got interrupted and it was hard to hear everything. But one of the first objectives is to explain how behaviors in adulthood are impacted by adverse childhood experiences. So, for example, if you have a 12-year-old, 13-year-old male who's witnessing only violence in his home or domestic abuse, then that child is going to learn that language. And then that language is carried into adulthood, and that is how that child begins to communicate with the world. Now, this is true in most cases, and of course, there's always exceptions where you may come from a home and for many reasons not carry that language with you. But most of the time, that's what is happening statistically. But then coming from a healthcare system, we want to look at, well, how do those behaviors that come into adulthood from childhood increase our risk for adult health issues? And that's what we're going to talk about today. But, just simply, if we even think about the propensity for an accident, if you've got someone who communicates with violence, then their likelihood that they're going to have a violent episode and end up with a gunshot wound, stabbing, motor vehicle accident from aggressive driving or drinking, while they're driving, then those things can bring them into the hospital because of a lot of those behaviors. But then going to our second objective is, well, what if they're not doing those things? What if, they do have those behaviors, but they've gotten some help and they're not having these high risk things occur in their life that would bring them into a trauma center for an accident or some kind of violent episode. The second objective is to look to see, well, what's occurring biologically. When children go through adversities in childhood, it actually creates a latency period to adulthood because there's biological changes that are occurring when there are adversities occurring during childhood that show up later into adulthood. And of course, we don't have time to get into it today, but those biological changes can actually become epigenetic changes, so above the genome, meaning that things that we went through, historical trauma, generational trauma, can actually move through multiple generations and biologically impact our children, for the next decade, 2 decades on down. Then we want to describe the definition of trauma-informed care, because this is a science-based presentation. The CDC and Kaiser Permanente, who did the original research study on adversities in childhood, wanted this to be applicable to community members. So we don't want to be just as providers, the people that heal the community. Communities often have the power to know what's happening inside their community and to heal from inside out. So the definition is just shifting our paradigm and thinking, what's happened to this person in place of what's wrong with this person. So for example, my dad, who's 88, a rural farmer, grew up in an area with not a lot of science background. We see a lot of drug misuse, a lot of things going on that lead to behaviors that are high risk. And he's even learned to say, well, what's happened to them? Wonder what's gone on in their life that's kind of put them where they are. And it's such a different shift because once we do that, it takes away the judgment and it takes away expectations. And the reason that it's important to take away certain expectations of people is that it also lowers our stress response. So for example, if I'm working with a patient and I expect them to be behaving in a specific way, to be following specific instructions, and then to be discharged doing certain things, and if they're not meeting those, and even if I'm, coming up against workplace violence, oftentimes I'll just step back and think, well, what's happened to them? Instead of what's wrong with them. And then that lowers my stress response because then I think, well, something's occurred that is impacting or creating a barrier into how they can function in a medical system or in their community, and how they can follow through or engage or interact. And it's very much like thinking about someone, if they have dementia, well, you don't expect them to remember everything or have good processing. Well, sometimes if we shift that over when we're working with folks who may have a high substance misuse, may be promiscuous without having good precautions, or drinking and driving, or even having abuse in their own home and abusive relationships. Once we shift and we start thinking, wonder what's happened to them, that allows a window to open up to see them from a different lens. And then once that happens, it creates an entirely new treatment plan. So these next few slides, I'm just going to run through because you're going to get them in your resources. The Adverse Childhood Experience Study is literally what created trauma-informed care. Dr. Vincent Felitti was doing his own research on bariatric patients. One day he literally misspoke and he asked a patient, how much she weighed when she became sexually active. And he meant to ask if she was sexually active and what her weight was. And he just put it together, and she broke into tears and she said, I was 40-some pounds and it was my father. Well, he had been working as a physician for about 20 years, and he literally thought that this was his first case of incest and sexual abuse. But multiple patients later, he recognized that different types of adversities in childhood somehow had a physiological, not just psychological, but a physiological connection to morbid obesity, which was his specialty. So he reached out to Dr. Robert Anda, who's an epidemiologist with Center for Disease Control, doing an epidemiological study on morbid obesity in America. And they began discussing this, and it said, it doesn't matter if you've got 200 or 300 people that you see a true connection with. We need a research study to look at adversities in childhood and then physiological, psychological changes, all of that in adulthood. So that's what happened. The CDC and Kaiser Permanente came together. They had 17,000 participants. It's a retrospective and prospective study. And because this is a preventative healthcare system, they were able to pull many, many records, all the way back to birth. And for those that are living today, they're still following. Now, of course, this slide is several years old, but you're getting about the 10,000-foot look or view of what has been used with multiple patients, all throughout the United States, multiple countries. And we'll talk about how many states in the United States is actually going to a trauma-informed care perspective. So right off the bat, we want to think about demographics. Well, this was in San Diego, California in the early 90s, and 74.8% of the population who used this preventative healthcare system was Caucasian. And the reason that that's important is that we need to look at other ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups, cultural backgrounds to see, well, what type of adversities occur in any of these populations, and is it pretty much equal, or are there additional things that are occurring in additional populations? Of course, you had to be over 18. And then when they broke down that 17,337, there is something that just really came to the forefront. The physicians that went into this, who was doing this research study, thought that children who went through adversities was basically females. And luckily, we're still we're now acknowledging the Me Too movement. We're seeing a lot of this stuff addressed with females, but I want you to look at this number. Many males go through all types of adversities in childhood, almost as equally as females, but we still don't have a good platform for men. And, that's really important when our male populations come into the hospital, because generically, because I don't want to put anybody into a little bubble, but males and females can react differently or behave differently in a hospital setting or healthcare or community setting from their own trauma or from their own adversities. So one thing I point out here is when we start to look at workplace violence, I really remind the nurses and the physicians, think about the fact that male may have gone through something and is getting triggered in these vulnerable situations. And then the other surprising statistics is that the physicians thought, well, anyone who had adversities in childhood, surely those are only people who do not have a higher education. But if you look at these scores or the statistics and data, it shows that this population actually had some college or college graduates or higher. So the majority, 70-some%, was basically you and I. Well, when this came out and they recognized that we had this college educated middle class population that had preventative health care, had good jobs, that were having all types of adversities in childhood, then they said, well, what does that look like when we get into populations who do not have the same educational level? And what they found from subsequent studies is that the lower the educational status, the higher the adversity rate, because there's so many points that goes into that. There's lack of resources. I mean, we're seeing that during pandemic. You have people who are normally it's taken 2 and 3 jobs to feed their kids, and now they've been stuck at home, and stress level goes up, substance misuse goes up, domestic violence goes up, child abuse goes up. So you can see how those things can really impact different populations. So to break it down, out of the 17,000, when they pulled the charts, there were 3 main categories, those ICD-10 codes, what's diagnosed and put in the charts. There were 3 main categories that were identified. The first 2 are on this slide, the abuse and neglect. There was 28% of the 17,000 plus that had physical abuse, 21% had sexual abuse, 11% had emotional abuse, and then under neglect, 15% had emotional neglect, and then 10% had physical neglect. The next slide was a surprise category. It's household dysfunction. And when we look at this, the physicians were saying, well, why do these childhood adversities impact the behavior of a child all the way into adulthood? And not only their behavior, but the physiology or the biology of that child. How can these things impact a child as they become an adult and have latency periods to health issues from diabetes, heart attacks, strokes, all the way throughout their life? Well, if we look at this list and imagine if you were the child that's in that 27% of someone in your household using drugs or alcohol, then your likelihood of not getting your food, not having emotional support, being abused physically, abused sexually, being sold, beat, all of these things dramatically increase. The next one, 23% lost a parent to separation or divorce. And what this means is it's not those parents that are divorced or separated and are co-parenting. This is when a child knows a parent has left, and then that parent never gets in contact with that child again. And the child may know that they're 15 minutes away. They may have reached out by phone or, emailed them, and they get no response. And so what happens is this child goes into that fight, flight, freeze response in the brain. And then there's this storm of chemicals in the brain. And when that occurs, then there becomes changes in the architecture of the brain. And that's true with any type of adversity in childhood. If it's pervasive, if the child's not being nurtured, if they're not getting those basic human needs that we have to have in order to develop in a healthy way, just like our bones, our heart, our brain is the same way. It has to have those things to develop. 18% of the member of the household was mentally ill, and this does not mean someone had a mental illness like depression, bipolar, schizophrenia. This means that they had a mental illness that was not controlled or regulated through medical care. So you may have a child whose parent has severe depression, unable to get out of bed to tend to the child, to work, to provide basic stuff, and then that child becomes stressed from everything that's going on in the household. Then there is 13% of these 17,000 that witnessed domestic violence. And this said against mother, but I always stop here when we're doing our long training and really go into this a little bit more, because it's not just against mother. And just go back to the fact that men are abused. Women can abuse men. We often forget about how much intimate partner violence occurs to men. And then with our same-sex relationships, it doesn't matter if the children's parents are male and male. It's if that child is seeing that domestic violence, or if it's female and female, it's just the child witnessing those things that put their brain into that fight, flight, freeze response and the storm of chemicals that are occurring. And then, of course, 5% of the member of the household was in jail or prison, and then that comes with its own issues. So out of the Adverse Childhood Experience study, which is called an ACE study, we found that adversities in childhood, those three main categories, or 10 different adversities in the original ACE study, is very common. You know, it's not, we historically and socially have hidden these things. You know, it's like, well, what goes on in our house needs to stay in here. But what we're realizing now is that creates silent brain injuries in children. And the quicker we recognize it, whether it's in childhood or even in adulthood, the quicker we can intervene. They often occur in cluster. It's easy to go from like one adversity to 4, 8, 9. And if you give yourself a 1 point for each of the 10 adversities that occurred in childhood, your minimal score could be 0. You had, no physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, or you can give yourself 1 point for each of those, and you can come up with a score of 10. Now, that would give you your ACE score. In the resources you're going to get today after the presentation, you will have your own test so that you can look at it and find your own ACE score. The reason that's important is often we kind of go through life not recognizing what triggers us or what depletes us. So when I'm teaching nurses, physicians, staff members, I let them know right off the bat, if you are working with a patient that may be a little triggering to you, or you feel your stomach getting yucky, you feel your headache, you feel that whole response system on yourself just getting exhausted, sleepy, something's not right, your irritability is increasing. And you think about, well, what's my ACE score and what's here that's kind of triggering that? Then it allows you to say, okay, I recognize these things in my history is being re-triggered by what I'm tending to today. So how can I get help while I'm at work? Can I switch off with someone, take a different assignment? Can I take a longer lunch? Do I need to, if you don't have help and it's one of those days that we're often having to push through, how do I take care of myself this evening? Do I need to call my partner or spouse and say, I need 30 minutes in a bubble bath or 30 minutes going for a run, and can you take care of the kids? And learn to do that so that your own adversities in your childhood are not triggered and create more compassion fatigue and burnout and vicarious trauma, because we have to have that balance of, well, if we have these things happen, we recognize these things are triggering it. So how do we put play and rest and security and balance and nurturing back into our own life? There is a cumulative neurodevelopmental impact. And if you get nothing from this presentation today, remember this. It is a snowball effect on the brain when children go through adversities. So what I mean by that is the child goes into a stress response system. That chemical storm occurs in the brain. And then as our brain is growing, if there's that pervasive toxic abuse and we're not getting our nurture and the things that we need, when those chemical storms occur, those neuron pathways that are supposed to be building the little roadmaps in each section of the brain so that we have reasoning, executive function, that we're able to down regulate, those neurons actually start dying and pruning off. That is the silent brain injury that occurs. So, and then the more of these adversities that a child goes through, it has that cumulative snowball effect where the brain becomes more vulnerable to having neuron pruning in different areas. So then you have your amygdala and your hypothalamus that goes into fight, flight, or freeze, whichever one is your body's response. We all have a different signature for that. I'm a fighter. Some people may be a runner, whatever. It goes into hyperdrive like it's going to the gym and working out all the time. but the other parts of the brain are becoming dysregulated, unbalanced, the neurons are pruning off, and there's no brake systems to slow you down, and there's all of these changes that occur, not only psychologically and cognitively, like executive function or psychiatric illnesses, but also the brain is the wheelhouse to the entire body. Your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, your immune response system, everything there can become dysregulated. That's where you get that latency period in your adult years where you have a easier or higher risk onset for diagnosis that can increase a early death risk. And of course, all of these things that are occurring, the psychological, the biological, the social, the neurological, increases, relationship issues with your health, your social and behavioral problems. So out of the 17,000, if you look at this and just think about our entire nation, because if we've done studies across the nation, every state is pretty much mirroring the original ACE study, which is what you're seeing today. We've also done it in other countries, and it pretty much also mirrors the original ACE study. Only 36% of this college-educated middle-class population had zero adversities. Just think about how many people you come into contact with in your daily care, in your family, in your church, or your community events, in your workplace. So what does that kind of translate to when you're working with other individuals as far as how many of us have had adversities and how that's impacting our society and has become one of the largest, most concerning epidemics that we face, even over COVID? So 63% of the 17,000, 63 point da 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 da, experience at least one category of childhood trauma. And if we just stop and think about what that means. So if I'm working with the nurses and I'm saying, how many's on your assignment? And they say, well, I have 6 patients tonight. So I'm like, well, at least 4 of those are going to be carrying adversities into a very invasive, no control, scary situation hospital with the worst health that they have in their life. And how is that adversity going to impact how they are able to be in that space? Are they going to become violent? Are they going to go AMA? Are they going to be non-compliant? There's all of these things. Their anxiety going to just go through the roof. I mean, what's going to occur? Same thing, no matter where you're at and what job you do. So becoming trauma informed, yes, it's looking at what happened to this person instead of what's wrong with this person as a common kind of definition for any lay person out there. But when we start to do this from a science basis, trauma-informed care provides a foundation for a basic, so we're just getting the basics today, understanding that adversities in childhood can lead to psychological challenges in adulthood. It can also increase your risk for a neurological challenge, giving you that silent brain injury where different parts of your brain has had architectural changes and then therefore becomes dysregulated for the entire body. It can give you biological changes because once that dysregulation takes place, the things that are supposed to be controlled by our sympathetic and parasympathetic, all of that that's in the brain is no longer controlled efficiently. Blood pressure, urination, respirations, heart rate, inflammation. And then those things that are biological, it doesn't change our genetics, but what it can do is change the expression of our genome, so that epigenome, meaning it's kind of like a little light switch above our genes that can turn on things like risk for obesity or risk for mental health disorders. And so even if our children does not go through an adversity in childhood, we know that some of those kids who come from famines, refugee camps, slavery, historical trauma, at birth, their cortisol levels are already increased. And then there's already these challenges at a genetic level. Good news is what we can, turn on through adversities, we can also learn to downregulate those and rebuild. So I don't want folks leaving out of here with that, oh my gosh, we're doomed. We just need to understand that first and then, learn about the resiliency and coping and all of that that comes later. There's also obviously a social impact. Trauma in children is billions and billions of dollars a year, from job loss, calling out from sickness, etc., using the medical system like the ED because they don't have insurance. So the areas of the brain that are impacted, and it did not go through. There we go. All right, so I'm not gonna, well, let's see if we can play this on here, and if we have to go back, we will. But I can also give you the link to this. Let me know if it shows or if it does not show on your end, and if it doesn't, I'll just keep moving and I'll just talk us through it.
It's showing.
Is anyone seeing it on their end?
Yes.
Okay.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Okay. So let's see if we can get back to my PowerPoint here. There we go. All right. So let's start with the hippocampus. This area controls emotional reactions. So you have that person that you give them some information or news, and you think their reaction should be on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe a 3. But all of a sudden you get that explosive reaction and it's a 9 or a 10. Or you get no reaction. Every one of us we are different. Well, this is due to having any form of maltreatment in the first 2 to 3 years of life. Now, most of us do not remember what occurred at 2 or 3. There's a few people that can have like a little glimpse, and maybe they've heard stories or have seen pictures, but most of us don't know what happened to us at 2 or 3. And the reason that's important is if you're working with someone and we've ruled out a pathophysiological reason for an explosive emotional reaction or a flat affect like a brain injury, severe mental health disorder, etc., then I always tell the nurses and physicians and the team members, PTs, OTs, counselors, go back to this, go back to trauma-informed care. What's happened to this person instead of what's wrong with this person, that they cannot control their emotional reactions. Also, it's important to note that forms of maltreatment in these years can also impact your verbal memory. And so you may have those folks that you talk to, you educate, you instruct, and they absolutely remember none of the conversation. And sometimes, we kind of often can label a person just saying that they may be manipulating the environment. And that may be true if that's the language they learned coming up as a child. But also go back to the hippocampus and think, is there something there that's not allowing them? So always with any kind of education, go way beyond verbal. There needs to be pictures, there needs to be videos, there needs to be hands-on for and engagement for somebody to learn what's actually needed to be learned. Then for like PTs, OTs, spatial memory, this is also important to look at if you have a TBI or a stroke or something and it's in a different part of the brain, but they're having spatial issues. And then the corpus callosum, let me make sure I just, yeah. This is straight down the middle of the brain. It's going to integrate the left and the right hemisphere. It's important for language development, proficiency in math, processing social cues. That's very important because we are social beings engaging all the time. And if someone has an issue with processing what your face means, you know, what the environment means, then you have people that are easily more triggered or not able to function in that environment. This area is vulnerable to neglect in infancy and then sexual abuse in the elementary school years. Also, if there's, I know there's all nurses on here, proficiency in math. A lot of people learn to say, oh, I know what medicine to give, da, 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 da. But it's a coping mechanism just like dementia. So you literally have to have them show you, do a pill box or demonstrate, you know, how many tablespoons, etc. For example, my dad, who's 88, having onset of dementia, I handed him 2 bottles last night, and he looked at it and goes, oh, this one's every 12 hours, and then this one's before meals. But then when I actually had him do like a pill box and separate out things and tell me milligrams, he couldn't do it. Same thing with this population. If there's neglect in infancy and sexual abuse in elementary school years, we may not know that. So we always go in to anybody and work with them based on the fact that we know 63+% of the population has had adversities that can be impacting their cognitive status in adulthood. The cerebellar vermis, this regulates mental health. So we all have the propensity to have a mental health disorder. And, you know, so many of the nurses that are coming in, even the physicians, I will ask them, I'll say, well, you know, which organ is responsible for our mental health? And I just get this blank. And I'll say, okay, which organ is responsible for regulating our insulin? And they're like, oh, pancreas, regulating, you know, respirations or heart. And so they're able to answer that, but they're not able to answer the mental health thing. And so I have to share, okay, we all have the same risk, just like we all have risks for diabetes, heart attack, stroke, cancer, etc. But we've lived in a society where we don't talk about that the brain is an organ, and it's always pull yourself up by your bootstraps and recognize that you just can fight through this and get over that. Now, there is something to be said for grit. I'm a Southern girl, and I believe in, you know, that perseverance. That's a very good thing to have. But we also need to recognize that when we have architectural changes to our brain, it literally can change our risk factors for having bipolar come on much quicker, much harder, much more difficult to control. Some of these patients who had high adversity rates were having hallucinations, delusions, schizophrenia was coming on with no medical history of any of that in their family. So there is a strong and direct scientific correlation between how our neurons are working in our brain and become dysregulated to our mental health in adulthood. This area of our brain is vulnerable to high levels of cortisol prior to puberty. Well, cortisol is a natural steroid, and steroids in general, whether we're taking them by mouth or IV, you know, they're good for short periods of time. But ongoing high amounts of steroid impacts our entire body. And puberty is already stressful, and we already have elevated levels of that, and then adversities to it, and that really impacts this part of the brain. The cortex, which is my favorite part of the brain. So we have the amygdala, which is kind of like that fight, flight, freeze, or faint trigger. It's kind of like the trigger to the gun. And it is the thing that tells us, oh my goodness, there's a snake, I'm screaming, I'm running, I'm fighting, I'm killing, whatever it is I do. And it gets you into that fight that saber-tooth tiger kind of mode. Well, folks with high adversities, their amygdala often gets stuck. And it kind of stays in that hypervigilant response. They don't trust their spouse, they don't trust their community, they don't trust the environment. They're always looking for and watching for something to go on to defense about, because everything is a true threat because of what's occurred, and then the amygdala getting stuck. Well, the cortex is the brake of our brain. It is the frontal part of our brain. You know, our brain forms from the back to the front throughout most of our life, and kind of in the mid-20s is when everything kind of finishes up. But if the break of our brain, that cortex, that frontal part, if it gets impacted, you can just say it's kind of like the brakes of your car is wearing out and they don't work as good. So you have folks that are now, they've never talked about what happened to them. It's been silent family secrets, and now they're coming into adulthood, and magically they're supposed to not use drugs, have good relationships, you know, be able to do X, Y, and Z like society's frame box says. But then it doesn't happen because they didn't learn that language, and then their brain doesn't have that full capacity because we have those changes. Our break of the brain is supposed to say, whoa, that's not a snake that you just saw, that's a stick. You know, it's supposed to say judgment. I don't need to go down that dark alley tonight by myself, or I don't need to continue to do X, Y, and Z that puts me at risk for STDs or being shot or getting into, you know, situations that are just not healthy. It's supposed to be that executive function that says, I have X amount of money on my paycheck. X amount of money goes into the bank. And so I've got X amount of bills, and I only have $100 or $200 left for the month. It also helps with long-term memory and vision. This area is vulnerable to trauma in the first several years of life, witnessing domestic violence in the elementary school years, and then sexual abuse at 15 and 16. So you may run across those folks whose trauma created an atmosphere that changed them psychologically, changed their brain, and as a child or a teen, they had to find a way to cope. So you may find that person with eating disorders, substance misuse, violence, whatever it is, that they, in that moment as a child, were intelligent and intuitive enough to say, I've got to calm down this tiger in my brain. I've got to find a way to cope through what's occurring in my life today. But then that becomes their coping mechanism throughout their life. And then along with those coping mechanisms, you have this cortex not working well. Then you have the amygdala that's on fight, flight, freeze, or faint. And then you have this person that says, I'm out of money. You know, I know my kid needs antibiotics, but they just went to Chick-fil-A and spent $50 or went and got 2 cases of beer, or went and used their drugs, and then they came back and they're mad at the world, and they have that workplace violence and say, you know, somebody needs to help me out. My lights are going off. Da, da, da. It's because they don't have the ability to have that executive function, think through and judge in the way that they would have been capable of doing if these things hadn't occurred and they had been giving those coping tools and language throughout their formative years. The right temporal area for speech therapists is a center for spoken language, vulnerable to emotional abuse, especially between 7 and 9. So I've went through several parts of the brain, and I've broken it down to like age categories. But adversities don't just happen most of the time in just like small singular events. They can, and they do, but again, they often occur in clusters, and adversities can be intergenerational. So familial patterns can be intergenerational. So children can go through adversities from childhood throughout adulthood, through every growth and development age that there is, meaning multiple parts of the brain can become dysregulated. So then what happens is, now this was the original pyramid from CDC. You have an adverse childhood experience. If it's pervasive and it's toxic, and if you're not getting help, you get neurodevelopmental consequences. Those 2 things lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. You get someone who says, I've got to cope. And so what do? They adopt something. They work with smoking. You know, back in the 1930s, smoking helped decrease our stress response. But it's smoking at 12 calmed them down. So what are they going to do every day after that when they have undiagnosed PTSD or this tiger in their brain? Every time that there's sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, whatever that's stressing them, they reach for the cigarette, it calms them down. It's a very good coping mechanism at that time. It allowed them to have friendships, it allowed them to go to school, it allowed them to survive the environment that they're in. Unfortunately, whether it's smoking, alcohol, drugs, unsafe sex, high-risk behaviors, those things eventually lead to disease, disability, social problems, and death. Now, this was the original because this was built off of the 10 adverse childhood experiences. But what we know since then is there's more than 10, right? We have those adversities that kind of can occur in a household. Then we have historical trauma, community trauma, systemic racism, slavery, refugees. All of those things are trauma. And they impact someone's social, economic status, their resources. You know, the trauma comes intergenerationally. Trauma begets trauma. So those things are there. And that's the community piece that also can impact the development of the brain. Then there is the environmental piece, what we're going through right now, which is hurricanes, tsunamis, mudslides, pandemics. So me working in infectious disease, you know, when the COVID hit, yes, I work in a research hospital. There were all of the professors and the doctors who were working on vaccines, rolling those out. But my job was to go ahead and form committees and work on what's going to happen to our patients and then our children 10, 15, 20 years out. So we started training people of, we're not through this pandemic once we have vaccines. Yes, that is the important part. But what we're going to see in X amount of years are these children with neurodevelopmental consequences from the neglect. The abuse that we did find, because most of these kids were home and alone and we were not seeing them as often because your social work wasn't getting in, et cetera, et cetera. The ones that did come into our trauma center, the severe abuse was just, it was horrible. Our substance misuse greatly increased, because if that's your coping mechanism and then you're placed in an even worse situation, the substance misuse goes up. So just know that there are more than the original 10, and that we're going to be looking at this epidemic, which is, again, worse than COVID, for many, many years unless we regroup and learn to think about our children in a different way and help them differently. So out of the 17,000, they pulled the medical records and they wanted to see, well, what's going on physiologically? What's happening to these patients? And these next two slides are the medical diagnosis that they actually pulled from the medical records. Hypertension, you've got your blood pressure that's not regulated. Ischemic heart disease, you have an inflammatory response. And I'm sorry, I've got someone that's getting ready to knock on my door. Cancer, chronic lung disease, liver disease, morbid obesity, diabetes. Sorry, I'm having to tell somebody I can't go. My dad is sick right now and I'm having to dual task, and they didn't realize it. GYN issues. So you may have someone that has 50 or more sexual partners in the same year or in a lifetime. And that was the average from the 17,000 patients, was 50 different sexual partners in their lifetime. And we think, well, why are we having, you know, so many sexual partners and higher risk for STDs and HIV? And, you know, and there's many reasons that go behind that, but it is because you have the neglect, and this is I can get an emotion of love from this. It's because it's a learned language. It's because, you know, women and men, but women who are abused sexually in childhood have a higher risk of rape in adulthood, around 35 to 40%. So and may sell themselves for drugs, alcohol, may have to keep the lights on for the children, the heat. All of those things are occurring. And of course, with that, you have pelvic inflammatory disease, the STDs, higher risk for cancer, etc. GI issues, peptic ulcer disease, reflux, Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome. And then they looked at the risk for having an early pregnancy in both the males and the females. The father, you know, boys becoming fathers sooner, females becoming mothers earlier. Well, this was very much what occurred. just because of everything that was going on. And regardless of your religious or your political belief, they also looked at how are adversities correlated to abortion. Well, we know if there's adversities, the rate of abortion goes up. The more adversities, the higher the risk for abortions and the higher risk for repeat abortions. So what we need to do is to get to the root cause of a lot of these health issues in adulthood: neurological risk, conversion disorders, TIAs, strokes, autoimmune diseases, relationship issues, substance abuse, violence, high-risk behaviors, and homelessness. And of course, from the inflammatory and immune response, when the brain becomes dysregulated and your immune response goes into overdrive, you have more inflammation, and that's why you've got this slide occurring. And just as a hint, asthma, of course, can happen with children who have no history of adversities. But the higher the adversity rate, the higher the risk for asthma, and it's one of the number one reasons that kids miss school. And then, of course, chronic pain syndrome, we're going to look at that. They wanted to look to see, is pain something that people just say, oh, I need pain medicine, I need my opioids, I need my IV drugs, and is it just psychological or is it physiological? Well, remember, these are physicians, so they wanted to look at physiological. They looked at substance P, which is a pain mediator, and for those folks who have adversities, the pain response is not regulated the same as those who do not have adversities. So that substance P becomes dysregulated. So you may have that 6'5" linebacker who has an ankle fracture but a high adversity rate, who's on the morphine PCA pump and who uses a lot of opioids, for chronic back pain and things like that outside of the hospital, compared to someone with no adversities who just came out of a motor vehicle accident and they use Tylenol. It's truly physiological, psychological. There is also an addiction process to that, and then there's some behavioral things. So it can be multi-complex with using substances to control different types of pain. This slide came out of a subsequent study, which was a nursing study that looked to see the risk for diabetes in adulthood compared to those without adversities in childhood to those with adversities. Unwanted sexual touching with adversities in childhood, 16% higher risk. So before the age of 18, if you had unwanted sexual touching, you had a higher risk for diabetes in adulthood by 16% compared to someone with 0. Isolated sexual abuse increased your risk for diabetes by 19%. Forced sexual activity before adulthood, if it occurred one time, your risk for diabetes increased by 34% compared to someone with 0 adversities. If the forced sexual activity in childhood occurred more frequently, you become at a 69% higher risk for diabetes compared to someone with 0 adversities. Moderate or severe physical abuse, 26 to 44% increased risk for diabetes, respectively. So if we're looking at adversities, there's it's not a magic number because a number is not a person's destination. And I just want to make that clear, because many people have 10 adversities, but because of resources in their life, whether it's nurture, a good friend at school, a grandmother, a safe church, a safe community, whatever, you can have 10 adversities and not have as many risks as someone with 1 adversity who had no support. But when we looked at the scores across the original ACE study and the 38 states in the United States that's done their own research, by the time you get to around 4 adversities, this is what you see. You become, if you're female, you become at 50 to 60% higher risk for depression for 4 or more. If you have 4 or more, your risk for IV drug use exponentially increases, and that includes opioids as well, compared to someone with no adversities. In our ID clinic, we also have a substance misuse clinic with Suboxone, methadone, and Subutex. And every patient that I've worked with, I don't know of one to date that did not have severe, and I mean severe, adversity. So anytime I see substance misuse of any kind, I just go into that trauma-informed care lens of, what's happened to them. Because once you start treating substance misuse, you actually begin treating anxiety, depression, trauma, all of these other things that actually drove them on that trajectory to cope through substance misuse. And risk of death by suicide, by the time there are 4 or more, there is nothing in medicine that is going to be more profound than this next slide. So many of the patients in the original ACE study just didn't show up for their next research session and all of that, and for the bariatric study and everything else. And they actually pulled the charts and looked. By the time you had 6 or more adversities in the 17,000, it increased the likelihood of dying by suicide 46 times compared to someone with 0. Or that's a 4,600% increase in attempt or death by suicide compared to someone with 0 ACEs. And this slide to this day just freezes me in my tracks. And the reason being is we still have a silent society and a lot of judgment. And we have kids who just had one in my immediate community this week in high school that passed away from this. And we miss it. I mean, like, we miss it. And there's no reason that we should miss it. And then those folks who stay alive and who cope by other means, whether it is prostitution, drug misuse, alcohol, high-risk behaviors, they're just judged and they're never embraced. And I always say, if you've got the 30-year-old or 40-year-old, mother who is got a good job, going to a local church, works at elementary school, and she's T-boned by a car, you have around 70 to 90 people from the time the EMS arrived to emergency to admission to hospital that is already on the scenes helping this person. You compare that to a child who's gone through adversities, they go their whole life without having one person show up. And then this is the slide that ends up happening. Compare that to our patients who may be smoking. We in nursing, we are always taught to really hone in on cigarette use. You never take away a coping mechanism without attending to the root cause or providing a healthy coping mechanism. But by the time you have 4 or more, your risk for COPD increases by 260%. 4 or more, your risk for hepatitis or liver disease, 240% higher risk. Out of the 17,000, when they looked at the lifespan compared with those who had 6 adversities in childhood compared to those who had 0, their life expectancy decreased by 20 years. So many of their patients were passing away at age 60. This is just a neat slide that I'll leave on here that, 10 years ago was being built, but it literally shows every area of the body that can be impacted by adversities because of the immune response and the brain changes. But you can go to PubMed now and you can literally put in the search engine, lung disease and adverse childhood experiences, or cardiac arrest and adverse childhood experiences, or any of these things, and PubMed is just full of it. So the ACE study shows that toxic stress from trauma in early childhood causes a physiological disruption that has that latency period that causes frank disease in adulthood, even at the biological level. So if you're exercising, doing everything right, you still may be at a higher risk for disease because of those biological changes that are occurring. Add on your coping mechanisms and your learned behavior and your social and community and pandemic challenges, then your health risks dramatically increase. So we want to make sure that we intervene and down-regulate ourselves into a decreased response. We can't always recognize someone with a disability, so we should never assume that someone doesn't have one. Many, many times I'm giving these presentations to very high-level folks who come up after the fact and said, I've never told anyone but. So the reason they had something in their life that was able to get them to the place where they were not using drugs, they were able to go to college, they were able to get a degree, get a job, but often seek a level of job that provides some sort of control, like management. And, you know, we sometimes don't realize that our managers, our organizational leaders can have adversities. And there's two parts to that. There's the part of compassion and understanding that they too can have it. And then there's the part that some of their toxic stress can go actually down into the employees. So we have to actually find ways within our system to support each other from an organizational standpoint. And after this webinar today, please Google or research trauma-informed care organizations if you've not already. There are 6 principles of working with individuals to individuals, which we will review in the next slide or two. We do not address organizational challenges and changing an organization to be in trauma-informed care in this PowerPoint because it's an intro. Trauma-informed care is not just an acute injury. It leads to all the issues we've discussed. And this came out from SAMHSA, which gives us the individual to individual 6 principles. It's their idea of safety, not ours. Trustworthiness and transparency. Many times people think sending an email is being trustworthy or transparent. No, we have to have communication, collaboration, mutuality, provide peer support. Find a way to empower a person. Some of the hardest situations that I've been in is working with abusers, whether it is, you know, child abusers, pedophiles, domestic abuse, and having to recognize how I set boundaries, because trauma-informed care is not meaning we give a pass or we don't set boundaries. It's meaning that we understand what's occurred and what's brought someone here, but we also set those boundaries in a fierce, compassionate way. Use fierce compassion, because anything that goes off the train tracks becomes derailed, and we want to keep people on the rail. And how we do that sometimes is set those boundaries and find the teeny tiniest little thing that we can. Maybe they remember to bring their child a coat today, and we empower them by showing that part. You did great on this. Here are the things that we're still growing and need to work on, but look how far you've come and you've done these things. Give a voice and a choice in their care, even if it means that it goes against everything that we statistically know medically is the best thing. And you write it, you document it, you share it with your cohorts in factual manners with compassion and fierceness, and explaining why you're using trauma-informed approaches, so that we don't have the gossip house and judgment that actually goes on, in our conversations a lot of times. We look at the culture, historic, and gender issues. That is very important. It wasn't part of the first 10 adversities, but we know culture, being in the South, there's a lot of cultural and systemic racism and issues that are occurring with historical trauma. We also work in infectious disease. I have, patients who are transgender that are not accepted, and they are scared of a medical environment. And we have to work with them where they are and what they've been through and where they are now. So we always use the universal precaution: be trauma-informed. Walk forward, trauma-informed with everybody. You just presume that anyone you come into contact with is being exposed to violence, abuse, neglect, or other adverse event. And I'm going to skip this because it's just the original physicians, and we're kind of out of time, and I want to leave room for questions as well. And I don't like this word resilience. I like coping mechanisms or coping tools, but resilience is more known. But not everybody comes into the world with the ability to have resilience. We have to help each other learn new languages, new coping tools, and we just give ourselves a little tool in our tool belt, each month, each year, whatever, how the pace is for every individual. We're all different, until that allows a person to have enough coping mechanisms to where they can be in their environment as healthy as possible. And of course, when you leave here today, this is a hard training, because you're sitting and listening to this and processing all that I'm saying and maybe what you've gone through and seen in your life. Just know over the next week, month, few months, even a year or two. Lots of good nurturing, self-care. Tap into your counselors, your psychologists, your chaplains, your nurses, your physicians, your community support and peer support for anything that has come up or that resonates with you, and you say, I need to attend to this in myself so that I'm being nurtured and I'm not getting trauma from learning about trauma. Okay, I think I've left us about 15 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and
this
kind
is
of go
great
back.
again. We do have one question. Go ahead and click off that screen if you would. I think just stop sharing your screen.
Oh, where we are here. Hold on just a second. Sorry.
It's okay.
Am I just clicking off the new share?
Yeah, there you go. That's it.
Okay. All right,
perfect. Good. Okay. So we did have one question. If you do have a question, I'd like you to put those in the chat, and we'll look at that here. We'll send those questions on and just ask Laneita to answer those. Thank you so much for that. And I appreciate the last part, because one of the things that began to pop up for me in my own mind was, is there, if there's something coming up in someone's mind today as you're talking through this, what do we do about that? So reach out to those people around you. You could reach out to me or reach out to your pastor or a good friend or somebody if you need to start talking about those things. The question is this. You've mentioned childhood quite a bit through the presentation. The reality of childhood experience and trauma's impact on our adult brains are, and for some of us is still new. So as faith leaders in our community, how can we engage parents and other adults to understand the impact of our actions on their development and prevent these future issues?
Okay, so there, and I know COVID has really put a damper on how we can do this, with group settings, but there are a lot of movies that actually are on the Adverse Childhood Experience website, or it's called PACES Connection, and you'll get that in your resources. But like Paper Tigers is one that comes to mind right off the bat, that a lot of communities are showing in their faith-based organizations, at their schools, or doing a community event that is a very easy approach where we can show our parents this in a neutral setting, to where it is non-confrontational. It is just, helping our community. So I would say, once you get to that PACES connection, start looking for those movie events that's been created from the trauma-informed care experts throughout the nation, and start showing those in your schools, your community, churches, etc. Great.
Are there other questions you might have? Just put them in the chat if you would, so we can all see the question. I had a question earlier, but how does this impact spirituality, trauma-informed care, and the adverse child experiences? How does it affect a person's spirituality and maybe even their spiritual development?
So interestingly, I'm working with about 30 other individuals on like a Barefoot Guide, and it's a faith-based compilation of stories from different countries in multiple states in the United States. And there kind of is a split. What I see in infectious disease is most people have a true anger for church and religion because of judgment and lack of support, and have turned away from religion in itself, and may have found other spiritual paths which may be a little stronger. And then there are those that church was their safe space. That's where they went and they got some type of nurture, and that's what they hold on to. But what I see often in my practice is a turn away from anything of a religious affiliation.
Okay. Are there other questions? All right. If not, you were going to receive as a follow-up to this. First of all, Laneita, thank you so much. Excellent presentation. Lots of good information there. And more than we probably can handle in about an hour, and we're probably all trying to digest that. And I hope that you'll have, this is just a beginning point for some of you on just understanding trauma-informed care. You are going to receive a follow-up email that will have several resources that Laneita has provided for you. So that'll come out in about 15-20 minutes to you. There's also a link to, in that email, a link to an evaluation form. We'd love for you to fill out that evaluation. It'll take you just about 2 or 3 minutes. We do want to hear some interesting feedback from you about this presentation. I do apologize again for the technological issues up front. In today's world, you're going to have them. I wish we could get away from them, but there's always something that goes wrong. But so you will receive that. I appreciate your participation today and look forward to connecting with you in the future. If there are things that I can support you with, or we can at St. Mary's or at Cabell Huntington Hospital here at Mountain Health, we want to do that. And so please reach out to us and let us know. Again, thank you for your participation today. Laneita, God bless you. Thank you for your time today, and we wish you well and wish your father well as well.
Yeah,
during this time. So,
sorry we had that interruption. His
that's no
tentative
problem.
name today.
It's life, that's where we are. So that's working.
And I did,
home.
Yeah, and I did put in the chat the name of the website that everybody can go to and sign up in. There's about 40-some thousand professionals in the United States that joins this website. It's PACES, P-A-C-E-S Connection.
Perfect. I'm also going to place the link for the survey in the chat, so you can go ahead and click right there, and that'll take you right to the survey. And we appreciate your feedback and